Right now, as a matter of fact, Modern Horizons 3 is coming out later this week, IRL and online. Merfolk is great, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Yo, what's good, Spirit Squad? Today we're here to talk about Magic's oldest Kindred deck, and that's going to be Merfolk. So Merfolk happens to be the one deck in Magic that's actually been more certain than death or taxes. Lord of Atlantis has been doing the thing for 30 years straight, and the release of Modern Horizons 3 is only giving us new tools. At its heart, Merfolk has always been an aggressive deck with a little bit of tempo elements that tries to disrupt the opponent while getting them dead, and the tools have remained largely the same over all of the years, but now Modern Horizons 3 is giving us even more tools for Merfolk than Modern Horizons 1 and 2 did. Those are going to be the things we talk about today. At its heart, Merfolk is a deck that's defined by its lords, and the term lord actually comes from Lord of Atlantis, where other Merfolk get +1/+1 and have Island Walk. This effect has been replicated quite a few times across quite a few creature types, but specifically Merfolk really loves its +1s and Island Walk. Master of the Pearl Trident was reprinted as a functional reprint of Lord of Atlantis that gives all of your Merfolk creatures the exact same text, and later on we've had access to a bunch of different lords, but the best of the bunch has been Voldalian Hexcatcher, where other Merfolk you control get +1/+1, just like Lord of Atlantis, but instead of Island Walk, you get to sacrifice a Merfolk to effectively force spike a non-creature spell. All three of these cards are good enough to make Merfolk a really aggressive deck, and as we see in Voldalian Hexcatcher, a disruptive deck at the same time. The next big selling point for Merfolk is actually the mana base. I've harped on mono blue spirits in Pioneer and just how good that mana base is and how simple it is. Merfolk has been doing the same thing for like 20 years. You get to play a giant pile of basic islands because those are what cast all of your Merfolk cards anyway, but you also get to play cards like Mutavault, which is all creature types, i.e. Merfolk, Cavern of Souls to make all of your Merfolk uncounterable, and then 1 or 2 copies of something simple like Otawara Soaring City, which comes into play as an untapped blue land, but also has excellent utility while it's in your hand. That's all you need. Sometimes in Legacy, you get to swap out the Mutavaults for something like Wasteland, but other than that, exact same mana base. Easy peasy and beautiful. Speaking of the lands, we do know that cards like Aether Vial happen to be both essential to Merfolk and pretty near and dear to my heart, seeing as this very channel started by playing Modern Spirits. But we also have things to cast other than Aether Vials on turn 1. We used to be casting things like Merfolk of the Pearl Trident, Curse Catcher, and those cards are a little schmedium at best. But now we get to cast really good stuff like Rishadan Dockhand and Tide Shaper, which means that our curve of play something broken on turn 1 and play a Lord on turn 2 to follow it up is not only reliable, but actively very good as far as plans go. But that doesn't explain what else goes in this deck, so let's check out the flex spots. So just about every archetype has a few flex spots that you use to dedicate to whatever gaps your deck has. Merfolk as a deck is typically very good against spells while they're on the stack. We have things like Voldalian Hexcatcher to make sure non-creature spells have a really hard time resolving, but also cards like Force and Negation and Subtlety can be used to pitch to blue cards from your hand to deal with spells while they're on the stack. And as a Merfolk deck, you shouldn't really have a shortage of blue cards ever. Our problems lie in things that are already resolved, or in generating card advantage after we pitch blue cards to set free spells. To that end, most lists are playing some number of Dismember to get rid of onboard creatures, especially things like Ragavan that come down early and are very scary once resolved. The idea is that once you resolve a Dismember and kill their first threat, you can then counter the next 2 or 3 and your problems are generally solved. So the force life that you pay to cast a Dismember usually isn't that bad. We also have things like Brazen Borrower to help deal with onboard threats, like big things like Scion of Draco, for example, or onboard things like Ensnaring Bridge that give us a really hard time when we are trying to win the game. To solve our lack of card advantage, you can play cards like Svaveloon of Sea and Sky, or even go back to a bit of a throwback in Silvergill Adept, which kind of just cantrips when it comes in, but replacing itself is pretty good. The only problem with these cards is that Orcish Bowmasters exists. Listen, it could be Legacy. 38% of decks are playing Bowmasters in Legacy. Just be glad we're not there and keep it pushing. So the first card that we should talk about is Harbinger of the Seas. This thing is going to be 1 in double blue for a 2/2 Merfolk wizard, so 3 mana total, and it reads non-basic lands are islands. This is effectively the same as Blood Moon, which is why this is Flood Moon, or Magus of the Moon, both of which see lots of play in formats like Modern and Legacy. Harbinger is in a pretty unique spot since it's blue instead of red, meaning we can both deploy this and protect it with counterspells. So next up, we've got Flare of Denial. If you pay full retail, this is just 1 blue for a counter target spell. That's cancel. That card doesn't see play in Standard. But you can sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay the cost for this thing, making it closer to cards like Force of Will, Subtlety, Force of Negation, Seeing a Trend. These are all cards that see play in Legacy. And now, in a deck just chock full of blue creatures like Merfolk, or spirits, this is going to be an absolute all-star. Last but not least, we have Sink into Stupor, and this is going to be an MDFC card that says return target spell or non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. Very exciting on the front face as it is, because we're already wanting to play cards like Brazen Borrower for onboard permanents. But cards like Seagate Restoration have already seen play because they can be pitched to cards like Subtlety and Force of Negation. This is a massive upgrade to that, so be excited. And now that we know what the core of the deck is and what the new tools look like, let's cobble together a list that accounts for all of the Modern Horizons 3 cards. Here, we've got both a mono blue list and an Izzet list that is pretty exciting as far as Kindred synergies go. Let's check them both out. But first, a word from our sponsor, FusionGamingOnline.com. Fusion Gaming Online sells all kinds of gaming goods like Magic the Gathering cards, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, and board games. All of our Canadian customers can save 15% off of all board games while the sale is still running, so check out their selection. There's a lot to choose from. Now, back to the video. So here, the first list that we're going to be looking at is just mono blue Merfolk, which has all of the new tools in it. We've got Sink into Stupor over here chilling in the land section of the deck, and that gives us a total of 21 lands where we were previously playing only 20. And the reason for that is because we're going full up on 3 drops. We're going to be playing 4 copies of Svaveloon of Sea and Sky and 4 copies of the new Harbinger of the Seas, and because we want to make sure we're resolving these on time every game, we're going to be adding a 21st total land to the package. All of this is going to be our 1-drop stack, where we have things like the Tide Shaper that we mentioned, Rishadan Dockhand as a 2 of, because we want 6 total 1-drops, if not even more, but we're going to start with 2. 4 copies of Aether Vial, because this card is easily the most broken turn 1 thing to be doing in the deck, and then 3 copies of Dismembers, because once again, we do want to be able to solve resolved creatures. We've got 10 Lord effects in here, and you can go up to as many as 12, but I'm going to be choosing to play 4 copies of Master of the Pearl Trident, 4 copies of Voldalian Hexcatcher, and just 2 copies of Lord of Atlantis for a couple of reasons. A, I wanted to simply make room for all of the cool cards that are in this deck, so I decided to shave 2 Lords rather than 2 other cards, but also B, in the first couple of weeks of Modern play featuring Modern Horizons 3, there's probably going to be a lot of Merfolk mirror matches, and in the mirror, Master of the Pearl Trident gives all of your Merfolk Island Walk, but Lord of Atlantis gives all Merfolk period Island Walk. So you could accidentally screw yourself over by allowing your opponent to have Island Walk. So I'm going to shave Lord of Atlantis down to a 2 of for now. Over here, we've got our free section, which is where our Flare of Denials and Subtleties are going to live for a total of 8 free counter spells in the main deck. But now, this is an incredibly reactive tempo deck that we're playing with here. Like, we've got ways to shut down their mana when you include Harbinger and Tide Shaper. We've got 8 free counter spells / responses to spells here. And we've got a lot of ways to deal with onboard permanents now between Dismember and any copies of Sink into Stupor you find. Our sideboard is going to be a bit predictive. Here we're going to be playing 4 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder because there's going to be a lot of sweet targets in the format when you include things like the new Nadu Stoneblade list that features Shuko. There's going to be probably dredge decks that come out of Cephalic Coliseum being a thing that's been printed into Modern. Lots and lots of jobs for Tishana's Tidebinder, and I don't really think I would suggest leaving with less than 4 in your 75 somewhere, whether they're in the main or in the board. We've got 1 copy of Brazen Borrower, once again to address resolved onboard permanents. 2 copies of Kira, Great Glass Spinner, are going to help against the spot removal decks that are going to be looking to take advantage of sweet week 1 creature type brews. So we're going to be looking at lists like Is It Murktide, things like Rakdos Scam, any of the mono black mid-range piles, any of those lists that are looking to overwhelm you with a bunch of spot removal and then resolve their own big thing. Those are the lists against which Kira shines really brightly. We've got 2 copies of Cursed Totem. These are primarily going to be for Yawgmoth deck, but I believe this card's going to have a lot of jobs in the upcoming future. Slumforge Mystic. We've got 3 copies of Unlicensed Hearse. Again, Rakdos Scam is going to be the primary target for this, but decks like Living End are still around, so you still want to be able to account for those. And speaking of which, we've also got 3 copies of Chalice of the Void. Not that I think Cascade's going to be a super huge part of the format now that Violent Outburst has been banned, but Living End is a deck, and you really don't want to deal with a lot of the 1-drops from a bunch of other lists. Decks like Is It Prowess, Is It Murktide, any of the various control piles, a lot of these decks have 1-mana cards like removal spells like Lightning Bolt, Unholy Heat, and cantrips like Consider and Preordain that you really just don't want to be dealing with. And since you're playing the deck with 4 Cavernous Souls in the main, you're not so worried about your own 1-drops being countered. Your opponent, however, could get totally locked out of the game by a Chalice resolving. So sometimes we're going to be aiming to do exactly that. That's going to be our first list. Now let's check out the Is It deck. So there isn't one clearly defined Is It list for Merfolk, but the idea is that we're playing Flame of Anor, which goes with wizards. If you have a wizard in play, you can choose 2 of the 3 instead of 1 of the 3, and all 3 modes are really good in Modern. Drawing 2 cards, dealing 5 damage to a creature, and destroying an artifact are all very, very relevant modes. This has even seen play in decks like Temur Rhinos when that was still a deck, because you could play cards like Tishana's Tidebinder, which is a Merfolk wizard, and Mutavault, which of course isn't everything, i.e. a wizard. If Rhinos can play it, why not Merfolk? Merfolk is a deck that accidentally plays a crap ton of wizards in the main deck, unlike Rhinos, which has to go out of its way to try to put some wizards in. Here we have cards like Tishana's Tidebinder, Harbinger of the Seas, and Tideshaper, all of which are Merfolk wizards, and I could have also put Vidalian Hexcatcher on, but that card dies so often that I didn't even really want to include it as a thing on the list. But hey, lots and lots of Merfolk available in the main deck if you want to make the deck building space available to play Flame of Anor. So now we've seen all the new tools that we're getting from Modern Horizons 3 and a couple of options on how to build with those tools. If you're playing Merfolk at all, let me know which version of the deck you like best and which of these tools looks the coolest to you. If you're playing a miscellaneous control deck that features Harbinger of the Seas, hey, maybe comment down your list and let me know exactly what you're planning on doing with that really, really powerful new card. But that is going to be it for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed today's deck tech and primer and explanation of how the deck functions. If you have, make sure you click the like button and let me know. If you're new, subscribe to the channel. We just hit 2,000 subscribers and I would love to see 2,000 more join the channel. That's it for today. I'll see y'all on the next one.